We don't learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on experience. Right? We don't learn from ideas. We learn from reflecting on ideas. If you've invested an hour and a half listening to this podcast or 30 minutes listening to this podcast, if you invest 33 minutes or 95 minutes instead of 90, or literally 91 minutes, and you take like 30 seconds to open up the Notes app on your phone and ask yourself the question, what are 3 useful ideas I got from this? What is something I want to do differently? That is a additional 0.1% investment of time for literally 100x difference in return of actually seeing any value translate to your life.
I was thinking about where to take our conversation and what to really bring out. And just from our initial conversation, I really found the level of practicality, the way you approach life, to be very interesting. Being an entrepreneur, you think of like this high risk kind of guy who's extremely out there with a vision, this, that, but you seem like to be very realistic about the things that you're doing, and you're still able to, at the age you're 25 years old as well, to kind of push through and create enough autonomy in your life to run this business and run it successfully. One of the conversations, I think, with Jeff Lerner that you had, what came up early on there was you saying that you were forced into entrepreneurship because of your own psychology. I don't know if you remember this.
I do.
I'm very curious to understand, when you say you're forced because of your psychology, what specific traits or tendencies within yourself did you see that made you choose this path? Again, with the intention that if someone right now is questioning their path, I want to see if they're able to relate or just get something out of this conversation because of your path. So we're going back to that state when you were thinking through these decisions.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize one belief I have about business, and this is by no means an original statement, or really any goal, right? The pursuit of the goal matters more than eventually getting the goal. Like, being an entrepreneur doesn't always mean being self-employed. It means like working towards being an entrepreneur, right? I think there's a lot of situations where having a job is the most productive thing that you can do at certain parts of life. For example, it's a lot harder to start a business if you have no savings. It's a lot harder to start a business if you have no network, if you have no skills. And if you also have, I think a really big part of it that people don't understand, what that I didn't understand earlier on or fully appreciate, was just how well you understand a market. And a market kind of referring both to like an industry at a demographic level. Like, for example, I worked in Bitcoin and crypto, so like I vaguely understood that industry a lot more than an outsider would. By no means I was an expert, but compared to someone who's never worked in that industry at all, just by working in it for a brief period of time, you have a huge leg up in terms of understanding culture and things like that, and nuances. Then also understanding how decisions are made and how companies are organized within that industry, and pain points and buyer psychology. So on the path to being an entrepreneur, it's less so drop everything, start a business, figure it out. It's more like, and this is, again, there's two kind of pieces of the psychology that you've asked, like the psychology that I feel like made me guided towards being an entrepreneur, and then also something that, to your earlier point, makes me feel like I have this kind of deep sense of pragmatism. You could, and I think sometimes you run the risk of being a bit too much, at least myself, of being an armchair psychologist when you're trying to diagnose like, why am I this way? A lot of it's like, well, what examples come to mind? Like, I'm really just trying to come up with a coherent story more than I am trying to derive a provable, because it's not really one of those things that's falsifiable or scientific, because it's like, well, I think this particular experience had this impact on me. And there's kind of that very Nassim Taleb style, like fooled by randomness phenomenon happening, where it's like,
can you talk a little bit about that? What is that? Fooled by randomness.
Yeah. Again, I think I'm going to caveat by potential, I'll misexplain the topic here slightly, but the whole book is all about a lot of like, not quite cognitive biases, but psychological errors humans make. So this tendency to ascribe a story to a situation. We just kind of have this need to like, why did things happen? Well, we need a story as to why they happen. More often than not, they happen because they happen randomly. Like, there was no grand plot, there was no conspiracy. Like, that's just what happened. And so sometimes when we paint a picture about why things happened, and then we use that as a model for reality, then when the future, a different set of random situations happen, that story doesn't really serve us. And then we've just made a whole bunch of wrong predictions. So a lot of, and I haven't read the book in a long time. And even when I read it, it was actually on audio. And so I don't want to like, one of Nassim Taleb, he's the author, one of his favorite words is charlatan. It's kind of just a word for like a fake or a phony or someone like pretending to be smarter than they are. And I really aim to avoid doing that when I like try to explain someone else's ideas, knowing that I'm doing it incorrectly to some extent. At least I'm capturing what hopefully is like a useful representation of some of the ideas. And the way I kind of describe it is, an example could be macroeconomics. And because he's a trader, and so, like, that's how he made all of his money, so he could just, hang out at cafes and write books, is being a really good trader. And so a lot of like macroeconomists, and this is kind of the human fallacy of, maybe that's the word I was looking for. I wasn't looking for cognitive biases. I was looking for the word logical fallacies, like common logical thinking errors people make. And a lot of one is being fooled by randomness, thinking there's actually something more cohesive going on. And so I think one of the studies cited in that book, or potentially a different one, is there's this like, I think they purposely get people stuck in an elevator or something. And people just smash the buttons in some pattern and then something happens. And so then they just try repeating that same pattern of button smashing, trying to make that thing happen again, when really it's just someone outside of the elevator just deciding at some moment to be just like randomly. People just want to think they understand why things happen. And so they're just really, really quick to try to explain them. And so, for example, people would say, back to like macroeconomy for a second, people will say, okay, well, this thing happened in the 80s, and that's because of this was the situation with interest rates, and this was the situation with this, and this was the situation with this. And then they look at present day and say, okay, well, interest rates are kind of doing that same thing, but Japan's kind of doing this thing. But then they completely miss some other factor that throws off the entire model altogether. And so you think you've gotten this clear understanding, when maybe it could be the fact that like, well, also what it was like drug usage like back then versus now. Like, we didn't think about the fact that like half of people in their 20s were totally high at that point, and today no one in their 20s drinks at all. So like, does that change anything? Like company culture, and then obviously of the internet. So it's this temptation to make very strong conclusions that are very incorrect, and how that leads to potential catastrophic overcalculations as well, because you just have done a poor job of understanding reality. And so I always say, every time I tell the story of like why I'm an entrepreneur, like why I felt the need to do this, there's probably some truth to like some of the tipping points and, very definite moments where I feel like in memory, in my head, I'm like, I know that on that point in time, I did resolve to do something differently. I was like, I never want to do this specific thing again. And obviously that was an important, decisive moment in the story. But to say I wouldn't have ended up here if that didn't happen is also unlikely, because there's just so much in the past. There's definitely some relatable beliefs for someone listening to this that might be on a similar journey. One, there's just a very strong desire to be rewarded, to be in control of my rewards. And so, for example, and it's not like, oh, the world should be fair, because that's a troublesome belief. If like you believe that the world should be fair, you're going to set yourself up for a lot of disappointment, because it's not always necessarily fair. It's almost never truly fair. I think karma is a very real thing, but even karma has its own patterns for when it's going to resolve itself. It may not be on a predictable timeline, just eventually. So it's not really something to count on, except for just that bad karma will come around. So just avoid putting out bad karma. But you can't be like, well, I made a deposit, so the good karma is due within the next 6 months. Yeah, go ahead.
No, this is a very interesting point, I think, on the randomness of giving and receiving. It seems like there is a level of trust that is required in the acts that you're doing, even though you think that you have more control over the outcomes as a result of entrepreneurship or whatever trade or career you are choosing, with the belief that, hey, I wanted to have a fairer outcome for the things that I was putting in, and you still don't know when you will receive the outcome for that input. So how do you navigate that?
There's at least a sense of, if it's a spectrum, you have a greater sense of control over it. The opposite example is when you're working at a job, you cannot decide to promote yourself. They just can't. You can decide to do your best every day, but still ultimately someone else has to decide, get it approved through layers of bureaucracy. You deserve to make more money, or you're twice as efficient as everybody else, so you should be able to work half as much and still make your full salary. You just can't push that through. It's very unlikely at a slow move. That you're just better off setting your own terms. So that was very troublesome to me, because I felt incentives are difficult to break, right? That's kind of another violet part of the human experience, is that incentives almost always explain most behavior, especially in the long term. And I felt I could not psych myself into being motivated in a situation with very, I don't want to say misaligned incentives, but poorly aligned incentives, let's say. Because obviously within an organization, in the long run, doing a better job is going to get you promoted. but not in any way that you have control over. And maybe I'm just was young and impatient and still am, but anxiety or frustration induced by having to delay gratification indefinitely with no real sense of no light at the end of the tunnel, no timeline, just didn't feel workable to me. And so if you have a goal that you know you want to achieve, feeling completely helpless about the path to getting there.
What was the goal at that time for you?
Yeah, I think when I'm kind of blending like a few different kind of corporate experiences, but for the most part, it's like, let's say I didn't think I was making $20 an hour at the time. And I don't know, probably wanted to make more than $20 an hour. It's like, okay, well, you can't yet. You got to get promoted to this position and that could take up to this long. And even still, it's like, okay, well, I'm literally stuck at this income level unless I do something else to make more money. Like it could be that simple. Like I'm just literally powerless to increase my income level in the near future. So it's like, if I want more money, there's no choice but to like go do something outside of work or just, I guess, wait. There's no, I don't know. It's like, it didn't seem like a good outcome. So it's like, or do something altogether different.
This is the same time where you also started your podcast.
Yeah, I'm a similar time in life. Not exactly overlapping periods, not like, same day, same week. I'd fully finished when I was working there before starting the podcast, but lots of overlap.
Curious, as a podcaster myself, my reason for starting this podcast was rooted in my younger self and just seeing the version that I want to kind of help through these conversations. So there was a level of internal beliefs and internal desires of helping my own self in some ways through others. When you started the podcast, what was your belief about what you wanted to do with this? But also, how did that change, if it changed at all?
My number one priority when I first started was very intrinsically motivated. I was an active and still am big lover of the medium of podcasting. And I'm just someone who likes to participate. Right. So I had, same story as the career thing and the entrepreneurship thing. It's like, I can't pinpoint A, B, C in linear order exactly what led to starting the podcast, but a few things that I know were important. One was Kyle, who I started the podcast with. We were doing mastermind dinners in person in spring of 2020 before the pandemic situation. And we had 2 or 3 of those that we felt like were awesome. And we had wished they were recorded because we're like, we'd love to have revisited that. And so we were already serious enjoyers of the activity of long form and deliberate conversation, and had a nagging sense of regret for some of them not being recorded or accessible. And then around the time of the pandemic, we had the desire to continue that tradition of those deep conversations, events, and we brought in outside speakers and we wanted to record them. So that's kind of the very natural impetus to start. And then from a career standpoint, Kyle and I had worked together on a few projects and both had the desire to figure out the whole self-employed internet income type thing, and had learned the lesson of starting a business for the sake of starting a business is oftentimes a troublesome pursuit, because that's not really the most important ingredient in the success of a business, is like the fact that you want it to succeed. That's a very important ingredient, right? Like maybe Napoleon Hill or some of those kind of like, I don't want to say old timey because I don't want to disregard them, but that type of book would be like the number one most important ingredient is your desire to succeed. That's what is the number one most important ingredient in your long-term probability of success, is your desire to succeed. But in terms of a specific business idea, you're not going to will a bad idea into existence. You'll learn things that will make you equipped to make the next thing work better. And that's what I'd say, right? Like I started with that just loose desire of like, I want to be in business. And then that manifested in starting several bad ideas, which led to then starting the podcast as a means of saying, okay, I no longer want to do that, of start businesses that have no real odds or no real hypothesis of success. So what can I do in the meantime that's going to prepare me usefully for when I do? And since I was still in school and not really looking for full-time employment, starting the podcast is what I thought of. And then also, this has become a much better understood, much less niche thing to say now, 5 years later, than it was then. But building distribution has been well understood by business owners for a long time. It's just like people hundreds of years ago bought up newspapers because they understood the power of distribution, right? Even back to like Ben Franklin type era. It's like people understood the power of distribution. Maybe that idea was forgotten and then remembered again in terms of the online economy. But when you already have distribution, that's half the battle, right? Half the battle in a business is getting your message out in front of potential buyers. So if you already have an ability to reach your potential buyers and you've built goodwill, they know you, they like you, they trust you, you've accumulated a lot of the necessary ingredients to sell anything successfully. So it's really just an exercise of like, kind of like I said at the very beginning, that if you don't know what to do, getting a job is a pretty useful thing to do, because then you get money, then you get skills, then you meet people, then you learn about industry. Another really good thing to do is just create content, because you learn stuff, you meet other interesting people, you build a skill, you build distribution. And those are also really useful things to have that will be helpful if and when you actually have a good idea for business to start. Oh, and by the way, it increases the probability that you're going to ever come up with that idea because you're actually in the game, right? Like I don't know if I have any today, maybe, but maybe tomorrow. Like most business owners that are, when I say successful, I mean like they're running something viable. Odds are they see other opportunities to go after that they just haven't pursued, because one of the necessary ingredients for success is like focus. Like you can only do so many things well. It's like there's a lot of opportunity I see. I think, for example, my business, we write newsletters for businesses. I have a very, very strong sense of, again, the same fallacy of the grass is always greener, but like YouTube is so powerful. Video content is so powerful. Helping people with video content is just something I think is still an infinite market share business idea.
I want to touch on that. Is outside of a podcast, is there anything else you would want to pursue from a video standpoint?
There's a few ways to chop it up, right? What customer segment do you want to serve? What outcome do you think you're going to be helpful with them with? I was doing a podcast between the time you and I last spoke. I did a podcast with Dickie Bush in person in Arizona, which was really fun. And he brought up this idea of a one chart bet, which is basically saying like, what trends are you confident are increasing into the future? So for example, in investing, like a one chart bet might be like, I think more and more people are going to need AI over time. Or you could even say like, I think the demand for electricity is going to increase over time in the world. Therefore, I'm confident investing in people who provide electricity, or like population growth. So then you're like, okay, well, people are going to need food. And my kind of understanding of some long-term trends that I feel really good about are, one, every business still needs to, I think as the market gets more global, people are presented with more and more options, right? Which means service businesses are more likely to become commoditized. And so how do you decommoditize yourself? The one bet I want to make is consumer purchasing behavior. Let's take it a step further. Human psychology, very unlikely to change, right? That's the reason why the Bible still resonates, because we're like, wow, that is like a great story about human nature that still feels accurate. There's like parables survive the test of time, because we're like, that is true. Like that is how people would handle those situations. Thank you for the lesson. And humans will buy in the same way, in terms of they're not going to buy from people unless they know them, they like them, they trust them. And then you break those down. What are the components that build familiarity, that build trust, that build goodwill, that build affinity? And some of the common ways to do that, right? Seeing someone's a person. So humanizing a company by seeing a person on their landing page speaking to you who seems very authentic, like a real person, not reading from a script, but just having a conversation. That's humanizes the company. That's why a lot of like the best known companies, their founders are very visible, because it humanizes the company and you associate that with the person that you believe in and that you like. And then other ways to build, that knowledge, that familiarity, that trust, that affinity, just education, providing useful, valuable information for people. That's why the reason people buy a Mr. Beast chocolate bar over a Hershey's chocolate bar is now they have a strong relationship with the brand. Mr. Beast has entertained me. Watching his videos, that's great, but like, how can I reciprocate the favor? I feel indebted to him for all he's done for entertaining me, with those great videos. So I want to support his chocolate bar. And that's kind of the same way. If even like more, we could call it boring, we could call it not boring, but writing services or corporate services. Like I'm going to go to the person who has been creating valuable tutorials. I'm going to choose to hire them. So video content as it relates to breaking down those barriers. So business owners creating educational content, and a very, very, very easy way to do this, easy conceptually, not easy in terms of the labor, is there's all sorts of tools. Again, back to pragmatism. If we want to like title the episode something about pragmatism, life's a lot easier. And so this is another kind of thing I learned from the podcast, was that the businesses that were successful were in response to problems that they knew existed, right? That's like the differentiator between, let's go with first-time founders. A first-time founder who's solving a known problem, or let's say it this way. If a first-time founder solves a problem successfully, it's a known problem, it's easy to describe, it's relatable, lots of people have it, and your solution actually solves it, there's a very high degree of, like very high probability that you're going to be successful with that, because you've solved a problem. And the same applies to content, right? So if you're making content because you want to make it, who's to say if anyone's going to want it? Versus, and this is, SEO, people who don't know SEO, it just stands for like search engine optimized. So if you go make videos based on keyword research, so you see what are 1,000 people searching for every single month. And when I say searching for, what is a question that 1,000 people are asking every single month? The first example I think of right now, it's very random, but like natural remedies for bee stings. Let's say you get stung by a bee, and so there's probably 100,000 people who search on the internet natural remedies for bee stings. And these tools, often they're free. Will tell you 100,000 people search for this every month, and it's actually not very competitive to be the number one result. So if you're an example in my business, I already shared what we do. We write newsletters for businesses. A lot of the customers that we use are familiar. A lot of the customers we work with are familiar with a tool called Beehive. It's a popular email publishing platform. And so I've been wanting to make this video for months and months and months, which is how to start a newsletter from scratch in Beehive 2025. There's probably like 15,000 people searching that every single month. And there's no video with that exact title. Now, if I publish that on my YouTube channel that has 13,000 subscribers, that's been around for 5 years, that has 300 videos, I've a bit of authority. I've got a bit of gravity on the internet. I've got some clout, not like a lot of clout, but in terms of like I'm not going to rank number one for Mr. Beast, right? Because 13,000 is nothing compared to 200 million. But in terms of like the niche of how to make a newsletter on this platform nobody cares about unless you're a publisher, I'm probably in the top whatever percentage. So when I publish that video, it's going to be number one. And suddenly I've got 15,000 people who are interested in starting a newsletter, watching my YouTube videos every month, humanizing me, getting value from me, and suddenly interested in learning more about what I do.
How did you get from 0 to 10,000?
Most of it came from a power law, meaning a small subset of the videos driving the majority of the results. Some of it feels almost unearned. There's a Carl Jung quote, which is, be careful of unearned wisdom. And I kind of apply that same quote to anything unearned subscribers, unearned monthly revenue, earned even like people who like take steroids, for example. Like anytime something comes too easy, there's usually some hidden cost that you didn't expect. And so those subscribers came very quickly, for example, from us posting, which I've since removed, almost all of them. What's the word for this? Sound bites from clips, YouTube short videos from popular entrepreneurs. The insight I had was the people who I want watching my channel, what are they already interested in? They already like Shark Tank. They already like Alex Hormozy. They already like Tim Ferriss. They already like Gary Vee. And so, because my original hypothesis was like, I'm going to bring really cool guests on my show. People who are interested in those guests are going to find the episodes and then find me and then think my show's good and choose to listen to more of me. And to some extent, that is still playing out positively. However, I was like, well, why do I don't need to interview Tim Ferriss to put content about Tim Ferriss on my channel. I can just go take a clip of his TED Talk and put that on my channel. I can go to take a clip of Barbara Corcoran and put that on my channel. So I had someone do that. And several of those clips went mega, I don't know about viral, but they had very, very big numbers relative to everything else on my channel. Like we published a Barbara Corcoran clip. It was called like, why you should always fire people on Fridays. So provocative, right? It's like, I love firing people and I love firing them on Fridays. And it was very provocative and got a lot of comments, a lot of rage. And so that drove a lot of views. And then I also published several Alex Hormozy videos that were just clips of him sharing great information. And they were just, got a ton of views. I probably got 9,000 subscribers from 3 of those clips. And because those clips each got 2, 3, 4 million views each. So if you think the conversion rate there, it's actually not that impressive. It's like, okay, 1 out of every 200 people who watches this clip decides to subscribe. Great.
It seems like you already had in mind the kind of person that you want to really bring to this podcast.
Yeah. So from a chronology perspective, I started the podcast in March of 2020. I didn't have that insight until, and I've also obviously clarified exactly what happened in retrospect. So I'm telling like a very favorable version of how everything played out. But even still, I didn't think to publish those clips until 3 years of doing the show. And you factor that, like, so then other people, right, naturally had some friends that I told this to, and they're like, I'm going to try that too. I was like, you should. But they had like 10 videos on their channel. They've been around for 2 months, right? So because we've been on YouTube for 3 years before that and had published 150 original long form hour content episodes, we had some authority already. So when we published those clips, they did better than like doing that would from a fresh channel. But then I learned it's something called like a theme page. Like it's not, again, you're never the first one to invent a marketing strategy, even if you discover it for yourself. And so a lot of people do this. They build theme pages and then then you just slowly direct that traffic to yourself. And where I call this unearned, right? The reason I bring that up is because those people didn't like my podcast, right? They liked those clips, which weren't my podcast. So then none of them, right? So now I have 13,000 subscribers, but my views oftentimes look more like a channel with low digit hundreds, because we probably maybe, if we never did that, would be at 1,000 subscribers, maybe. And so then it's like, okay, well, what's going on here? Like, why do they have all these? So then it almost looks fake, because it's like, you have so many subscribers, but no one watches your videos. First, if I had like 500 subscribers, I was getting 200 views per episode. They'd be like, that's about right. His audience is pretty engaged. Versus now it's like 13,000 subscribers, 100 views per video. Okay, what's wrong with this? Something's not right here. Did you buy them? It's like, no, I did earn them all organically, but not in the most effective way. And so for a long time, the past 2 years, ever since then, you've month over month kind of been like losing subscribers net, because those people are slowly dropping off. So even if we're gaining at a nice pace of like 50 a month, if we're just losing 60 fake followers a month, the net, then it's like, okay, well, I'm putting all this work in to lose whatever. And so we've recently shed most of the bad ones, or like the pace of acquiring new ones has started to increase again. So month over month, we are adding subscribers, but there's always a cost, man, for like going too fast.
What has been your focus on the pod? For someone who's very early on in this process, even earlier than you, for example, what would you advise to them? And this isn't just limited to a podcast. It's over to any business or any level of sales that you want to employ in your life to bring the right people on. How have you gone about thinking through the customer, the person in front of you, the person you really want to talk to?
I mean, it's all about why you're doing it. So my original sales pitch, right, like definitely played the college card. It's like, it's, if you unpack the psychology of the person, like why would they say yes to this, and or why would they say no, right? What are all the reasons they'd say yes? What are all the reasons they would say no? And then what are all the reasons that you could make yourself desirable, or you could make yourself undesirable? Like what could you do to repel them, or what could you do to attract them? And I guarantee if you pause this and, pull out a piece of paper, make some quadrants, what would make someone want to say yes? What would make someone want to say no? What could I do to be attractive? What could I do to be repulsive? You'd come up with a lot of good ideas. And so, for example, someone might say no. A reason someone would say no is they're like, this feels like it's going to be a waste of my time. Why would someone feel that, right? How would I overcome that proactively? So a guest I really wanted to interview early on was this guy named Cole Schaefer. He is a copywriter. I actually didn't even know this at the time. Like it was completely unrelated to why I wanted to interview him. But he was dating Casey Musgraves, who's like a very well-known country music artist. I didn't even know that. Like it's like the day I went to publish it, like Googled his name to make sure I was spelling it correctly. And then it was like People Magazine was the #1 result. And it's like the mysterious internet copywriter who's dating Casey Musgraves. Was like, who's Casey Musgraves was my next question, because I didn't know who she was because I live under a rock. Anyway, I sent him an outline of here's all the questions I want to ask you. I personalized the outline to match the fonts and the colors and the design and the vibe of his website. Like I didn't just send him a Google Doc with Comic Sans. Like I found the font he uses on his website. So like what that shows you is like, I'm going to come prepared. I care about this. You're not just a random person. Like I specifically admire you and I have good questions to ask. So I'm not going to waste your time. I'm going to show up prepared. So I already signaled to people, I'm going to show up prepared. And then the one thing about podcasting versus sales, podcasting does have somewhat of like an inherent benefit for the person coming on as an interviewee, assuming they're not super famous, because most people don't have a captive audience who cares to hear them tell their story. Very rarely are you invited to an hour situation where you're expected to talk for 45 minutes and everyone's really happy with that. Like I had breakfast with this guy named Ira in New York earlier this last year, maybe a year ago. And I felt terrible. It's like all he did was ask me questions the entire time. I'm like, dude, like I didn't have a chance to ask you any questions. Like he just like usually a conversation kind of hits like a natural stall, whereas like you kind of pivot and you're like, let me ask you some questions. Let's hear what's new with you. But he was so interested to hear what I was up to. And I felt awful. I'm like, am I an asshole? Like what's wrong? Like, we got to hang out again. Like you didn't even give me a chance to like, but like on podcasts, I don't feel that way. It's like you invited me here because you wanted me to talk about myself and my ideas for the whole hour. People love that, right? We're self-interested creatures. That's why, like they say in How to Win Friends and Influence People, the sweetest word in the whole English language is someone's name. That's great. So unless you're interviewing someone who's bombarded with interview requests, they're humbled at the opportunity to finally have someone care. It's like their wife doesn't want to hear them talk. Like the best example is like crypto. Like guys in crypto, their wife doesn't want to hear about Bitcoin. Their friends don't want to hear about Bitcoin. No one wants to hear about freaking Bitcoin. Suddenly, someone's like, will you come on my podcast and talk about Bitcoin? This guy's just like, all he does in his spare time is read about Bitcoin. And everyone in his immediate vicinity is like, if you talk about Bitcoin one more time, we're not friends anymore. And then you break through with like, hey, actually, all the stuff that you think is interesting, I think is interesting. And I want you to talk to me about it for an hour. Like that's a very good offer versus the opposite. It's like pitch slapping, which is in sales, like, hey, I don't know you. Can you hop on the phone so I can try to sell you something? No one, that's very undesirable. No one's going to say yes to that unless you've given them a reason to get on the call. Like, hey, I've pointed out a problem. So I mentioned that I had interviewed Dickie Bush last week, and his business partner is this guy named Nicholas Cole, and he puts out really good content about a lot of things, but some of it is sales content. And he has this great one-liner, which is like, the customer has to care about the problem before they can care about your solution. So if instead you approach a sales call like, hey, I noticed you're making this mistake and several others. I have some ideas for how you could do them better. Would you be open to having a conversation where I could share them with you? Because suddenly you've piqued their interest. And now, just from hopping on the call, they know they're going to get something of value. And also because you've taught them something, now they're also like, okay, well, what else does this guy's clearly useful. Maybe is some other stuff for me. And so that's a few thoughts. But yeah, if you make that quadrant, and then a few other tricks as well, maybe I really only address like how to be repulsive, but how to be attractive, magnetic, is also playing the credibility game and kind of like the cool kids game, which is once you interview 1 to 3, it's kind of this like, there's this book called The Third Door by Alex Banyan, whatever. And great book. Most people read it in 1 to 2 days. And kind of this idea of like compounding or like snowballing within social situations. It's like if you interview, let's say like if I had Nick Saban on my podcast, the coach of Alabama football, right? He was the coach, but he's not anymore. If I had Nick Saban on my podcast and I reached out to any other college football coach and said, do you want to come on my podcast? Last week I interviewed Nick Saban. They're all going to say yes, all of them, because no one is higher than him within that sphere, right? So if you can go, and so the way you get there is like maybe you interview a couple of D3 coaches, yes, them to interview to some like, hey, who's a coach who you think would like doing this? They introduce you to some D2 coaches and you kind of ladder your way up. Then all of a sudden you're interviewing a D1 coach in person in your local town. And then now you have that in-person footage and it kind of like snowballs the credibility on top of itself. But then once you've had those marquee people, you just build the credibility. So it's like starting with what's approachable. So it's like I did personal network, and then I asked personal network for referrals of successful people they know. Then suddenly I've had a couple of really big people on. Like one of the biggest guests I had in the first 100 episodes, and he's still theoretically one of the biggest guests, is this guy named Howard Lindzen, who created a company called StockTwits. He's got a big Twitter account. He's a very well-respected venture capitalist, angel investor. And it was just someone I knew him. I was like, you should interview my uncle. He loves podcasts. It's like, sure. I had no idea this guy was like a huge venture capitalist. But then I had him. Let's see, okay, well, what people are familiar with him? Lots of other Silicon Valley heavyweights, lots of other people in that industry. And then it just all builds quite quickly.
That first person that you got that you really thought was out there and very credible, what have you done right in getting those people on? One is personal network, but also at the same time, people can say no if they want to, right? How have they said yes? Have you done something specific in that process?
Having done some reps. So like I did 25 interviews with just, we could call them low stakes interviews. Friends, family, professors, people I already knew that felt approachable before extending that. So like I had no fear that I was going to bring someone on and I wasn't going to know how to use the software. I wasn't going to know how to run the show. I was going to be like, I had no nerves about the basics. Also had a process. Like it wasn't like I didn't have to play like I knew I had a Calendly by then, right? So like I'd gone through the reps in trial runs. Like I'd done enough dress rehearsals where I wasn't really worried about a very basic mistake. So that's like a big part of it. And likewise, because of that, it's like I could say in my message, I'd love to have you on the show. We've published 25 episodes, right? That's a big difference than, hey, would you want to be the first guest on this podcast? Also, you've never heard of me. And then same thing for those early people. I put a lot of effort into what I want to talk to them about. Like I wouldn't be like, I want to talk about how you're successful and like your advice for young people. So, okay, everyone wants to ask them how they're successful, like knows, but specifically showing like I did literally any amount of research. I wanted to ask you specifically why you invested in this company at this time when it was not yet obvious that A, B, and C. I also wanted to ask you specifically, right? You're in Arizona. Why do you live here? Like, why are you successful living outside of San Francisco? Because, and then specifically, selfishly, I am a young entrepreneur. I'm interested in A, B, and C. I'd be curious to talk through that decision with you because you specifically did this. And so just effort, right?
Today, I was talking to a friend, and we both came down to this core belief that effort is the prize for this whole process. Where I think I've heard Alex Hormozy say this at some point, which is like the work works on you more than you work on it. And it's this concept of where the act of doing something without knowing if the results will come, when the result even does come, that result is very transitory. But what stays there is the kind of person that you have become as a result of the act of working. And so a lot of times we're stuck in that outcome based mentality, but what we're not realizing is that we've gained something much deeper, which is that we can, if another condition arrives and we're facing a similar problem, we already know how to go through that. I want to ask you about this concept here that you said when it comes to you choosing a newsletter as the product that you are selling and helping others write newsletter. Where did that insight come from?
Yeah, it's a combination of the experience that I had and the jobs that I had. So I'll try to limit this to like 3 to 5 main reasons. One, when I worked in my first job out of school was at Bitcoin Magazine. They have a magazine, a print magazine. They host conferences, the Bitcoin conference every year. They've had major speakers, right? Trump spoke last year. Robert Kennedy Jr. spoke last year. Lots of obviously like Bitcoin people, Michael Saylor from MicroStrategy. They've had some like, I don't know if Bukele's never come in person, the president of El Salvador. Heads of state. It's been, very who's who of influential folks. And so I worked for them, but everything for them was on the back of the newsletter. Right? Everything was on the back of the newsletter and their social following. So it's like, how do you reach people? So like very heavily content-led business, right? They're a magazine, they're a publisher. So it's like, okay, if you have a big newsletter, that's useful, mental note. And then after that, I worked for Anthony Pompliano, who's one of the top 10 finance newsletters or invest newsletters on Substack. Same thing. It's like, well, this is not me sharing anything that's not public. It's like, he's got a big newsletter on Substack. It's like, okay. He launches a lot of these businesses. They're successful quickly, right? He's very bright. He only introduces good ideas and he builds high quality products and he has a big audience, right? Newsletter, super powerful, mental note taken. I also just loved newsletters, right? It's kind of what I said about podcasting. Like I just love the medium of podcasting. I love the medium of newsletters. In college, I didn't have social media for almost all of it, or at least like a full 2-year stretch, maybe let's say like freshman spring until junior spring. So probably like a full 2 years where I had zero except LinkedIn. And like when I say zero, I mean zero. And how I got all of my information was from newsletters. So it's like, oh wow, these people send you information. That's a lot more. I like it a lot better than reading from like a institution like CNN, who might as well be labeled a terrorist organization, in my opinion. But I'm not a CNN fan. And these other organizations, it's like I don't like them. I don't trust them. This is even before the whole COVID thing. Was like I just hate these people. No offense to CNN. Yeah, lots of offense to CNN. Anyway, the point of this isn't to bash on CNN. I just really don't like CNN. Now I'm back to the point. But I loved reading because again, there's no relationship with CNN, or there is, and it's a hate relationship. Versus like an individual publisher, someone like Glenn Greenwald, who I don't agree with him on everything, but I think he's a good journalist. He's the person who back in like 2011 released the Edward Snowden story on The Guardian. It's like that was his real big breakout story back in the day. And then ever since, I don't know, some point in time, struck out independence. Reading just his newsletter, or Barry Weiss, just other people. It's a better way of getting information than the social feeds. And so those were 3 important points in terms of like my knowledge and appreciation of like the product and the industry and the value of it and some experience I had doing it. And then later on, when I was working in terms of now let's go with the buyer psychology of it. I had worked with my business partner at Orbit Metrics, which we still operate, which is our data and analytics consulting firm, the agency we started at first. And he started it and brought me in about 6 months in. That business, he brought me in to do sales and marketing to go find. He's like, I started this business. I got a couple customers, go find more, keep me busy. It's like, cool, I'll go do that. And for months and months and months and months, it was like, we should have a newsletter. I should start one. But we were very early. We didn't have a lot of money. And I was like, I'd love to do that, but I just need to go get the next customer. And the newsletter, guaranteed bring a return eventually, but like I just cannot do anything but like I cannot put the phones down because I need to go get a sale. Otherwise, we're gonna like not have a business. And so I just saw firsthand, who am I, right? I'm someone who loves newsletters. I enjoy writing. I had my own Substack for a year that I did every week. That was super rewarding. So it's like I actually love the act of writing. I've seen how powerful newsletters are. I work for a business in a sales and marketing role. I'm 100% in control of my schedule. I've got now the CRM of hundreds of people I want to keep in touch with, and I'm still not doing it. That's insane. Right? It's crazy. And so that was one big point in the story. And then the last one is that some frustrations I had trying to sell the data and analytics product, why I was still like hustling after whatever period of time to get the next customer, was I never got very good at compressing sales cycles. It's just hard. And maybe I'm still like, maybe if I worked on it for 3 more years, I'd say it's not so hard. But that service we sell, it's a lot more, it's expensive, it's custom, it's complicated. It's like, heck, we need to make a proposal. I need to audit your system. I got to like do some software stuff. Like the nerds have to have a meeting of the minds, and that just takes a long time. I wanted to also be able to sell like things I've learned about sales and marketing in the year of working on that business is like, it's a lot easier to sell something that's directly tied to revenue than it is to sell something that feels more like this is like, it's just not sexy. Versus selling marketing services is like, well, look, I'm going to do this, and within 3 to 4 months, you're going to make a positive return on your investment, and it's very obvious. That's just an easier sale. And I also want to sell something less expensive, where someone could like almost impulsively decide, you know what, I agree, we've been needing this, let's give it a shot, let's pay right now. I meet you, end of the day, you're signing up. Versus like, okay, great, you got to have a call with this guy and this guy and this guy, and I don't buy anything from technical people without this guy trusting it because I've been burnt so many times. People just have trauma, dude. People have trauma about hiring technical teams for anything technical. People do not have as much trauma with hiring marketers.
Really?
Yes.
That is interesting insight. I would have not guessed that. I would have said it's the opposite. In my mind, it seems like there is a higher trust in a technical talent than there is in someone in marketing, just simply because of the distance between input and output for technical talent versus marketing. Sometimes it's a much longer term game, right?
Well, I think there's a gradient, right? Like if I send you code, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's like, and it takes a long time to know if it doesn't work. Like if I hire a developer and they say it's going to be 20 grand and take 6 months, like a lot of the time you won't see anything for 3 months. By that point, you've already blown $10,000 of the budget. And then halfway through, you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. Scrap the whole thing. You're 3 months behind and you have nothing and you've wasted 10 grand. And there's nothing reusable. There's nothing workable. Versus like marketing, it's like, okay, we'll get started. Week 1, you'll have a draft of a newsletter. And then let's say for God forbid, we're terrible. They're like, oh my God, this is terrible. Let's shut this whole thing down. They spent $1 grand. They spent like not a lot of money. They could probably get a refund because it's like, hey man, we've been working together for a week. This isn't working out. I'm backing out. More likely to get a refund versus like, hey man, I've been working for you for 3 months. I've spent 10 grand paying my developers. I can't give you a refund. Versus like, yeah, I'm sorry. I guess my team didn't meet your standards. Again, not saying this happens, but like from their perspective, it's a lot. You just get feedback much more quickly. It's not so all or nothing. And then also, yeah, that's just my experience.
Is there any particular way that you're currently already using AI, for example? Where are people's minds with AI and newsletters?
You can slice it up a couple ways. One way of slicing it up is how do I pretend AI doesn't exist? How do you make a newsletter, right? It depends on a word I've been using a lot more lately is resolution. It depends on the resolution of your answer to the question. If you're answering in a very high resolution, right, like 1080p or 4K, it's like, okay, well, writing a newsletter is I do a bunch of research. Let's say I already know who the client I'm writing for. I have to pick up a topic to write about, and then I have to like come up with an argument, and then I have to, or like a point or something I'm going to teach about, just a main point, and then I need to go find reference material or evidence or examples to back up that point, and then I actually have to like write a cohesive piece of content about it, and then I would need to make sure it's error proof, etc. So that's like one recipe for how you could write a newsletter. Let's say you're writing more of a newsletter, something like Morning Brew style. So it's like, okay, I need to go find 20 recent news stories, and then I need to summarize them and put them in this format. So I just think about every component step for every particular newsletter recipe And only then do I think about, okay, where could AI make this step higher quality or more efficient? And so on the research step, right, you could use a tool like Perplexity. So instead of using Google to say, show me 3 interesting articles from this week about finance, it's like you ask Google, you ask Perplexity, what are some interesting things? Or again, topic ideas. You say, I've already written about these 20 things. What are some other potential topics that would be interesting to an audience of A, B, and C, where I've already covered this and they want sophisticated topics, not very juvenile topics. Like if you're pretending like this is a university, I want things that would be 400 level lectures, not 100 level lectures. And so then ChatGPT gives me 15 interesting ideas. And then I say, okay, these 3 are interesting. This is closer to what I'm looking for. Give me some more ideas. So now I've got a sparring partner when I pick a topic to write about, rather than just like me, myself, and the whiteboard. I've got me, myself, the whiteboard, and ChatGPT. So that's great. I've got like this nice engine for creativity to help me with. Same thing. Now I need to go do research. One thing that we do, right, is we pull in thousands of articles that are potentially interesting. So I've picked a main topic. Now it's like, okay, how do I find information about this? I could just like come up with a Google search myself and like, or I could say, Google, I could ask ChatGPT to write me like a Boolean query that's likely to find really niche results. Or I could use Perplexity, or I could use, it's called Exa is another tool, EXA. And they're really good at finding like things that wouldn't be on the first few pages of Google that are also highly credible. So now I found some interesting sources. And let's say pull in 50. Again, I have AI distill them all into 5 bullet points, rank them based on which are most likely to be relevant for me based on some existing criteria. And now I've skimmed through 50 articles. I've considered 50 pieces of content in 3 minutes rather than 3 hours. And then now that I've picked them, again, pull out the 20 key quotes, the 20 key facts, etc., assemble that into an outline based on this key topic. And then I've presented with a like very high quality outline with a lot of supporting materials to support my claims and examples that would have been creative and anecdotes I wouldn't have found anywhere else. Then, okay, now turn this draft outline into something else. And okay, now fact check. So it's not like, hey, ChatGPT, give me a newsletter for ABC. It's, I already have a process. Let's augment every step, like a cyborg.
The big point that came up when you were talking about this, I mean, the first thing that you have done is been a consumer of the very product that you're creating consistently for a long time. And I think a lot of us are trying to go to something that we just see is interesting, but outside of our consumption behavior. And it doesn't come as naturally as a result of that. So, I mean, that's a huge takeaway for me is just focus on the natural curiosity that you've always had and the behaviors and habits that you've developed and see how can you turn that behavior habit to help someone else, convert that into a product for someone else. The other thing is I find, trust as a person, like trust towards an individual versus trust towards an organization, like you talk about CNN. It's very hard to understand or trust an organization versus an individual just because you don't understand the person for who they are in an organization. And for example, a lot of the people that I've talked to who are in their 20s typically want to work for consumer companies more than they want to work for a B2B company. I'm just saying a B2C versus B2B. And I think it goes back to this thing around you have the individual in front of you with the needs in front of you. And a B2B seems to be this very vague entity that you're seeing is like it does not make sense, and you're not able to truly understand and clarify the intent of this entity, which I think is easier with an individual. That's what came to mind. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's why one of the most important exercises for any B2B sales and marketing is like they say to make a persona, right? Your customer persona is not a company. It is a person at a company who makes decisions on behalf of a company. So I have an SOP for us writing our own newsletter, right? SOP, standard operating procedure. You could just call it a checklist. I'm like, before we sent this news, and I put a picture of like 4 of our customers, like a real photo of 4 people who are our customers at the bottom of this SOP. It's like, does this newsletter make sense to this person? Like, real photo. This is who she is. This is her story, right? Because she is the CEO of a company that bought from us in the past. It's like she is a great representation of the type of person I want this content to make sense for. So from her eyes, does this make sense? For example, like I will drill this into my team a million times. I don't want our newsletter to say, how to grow your audience. Our customers aren't trying to build audiences. They're trying to build pipelines, right? It's B2B. We're writing newsletters for other businesses. They're not trying to become Mr. Beast. They're trying to just use the newsletter as a sales tool, let's say. And so if we say audience, that doesn't resonate. If we say prospects, it does, right? Those are, you have to use the vocabulary already in their head. So
That's valuable. I just had a question on this. So when it comes to your own beliefs about yourself, were there any major beliefs you had uh, earlier on that you really had to just switch up to get really good at agency or entrepreneurship at large?
I mean, I think there's like a rite of passage. It's almost predictable in hindsight. And that's why you like hear people like Dan Martell or Alex Hormozy say like, right now you're probably thinking this and that's garbage. And then you're going to think this and that's garbage. And then you're going to think this. So it's the same game, right? Like to scale any business, realistically, there's only 1 to 2 things you need to be innovative at to be successful. It's like you're not going to reinvent accounting. It's like they've already solved the problem of like how to keep track of the finances within your business. Like you don't need to be innovative at how you do accounting. If you're too innovative at it, you're probably going to jail. So for example, the only thing that my team needs to really be good at is how can we be the best in the world at writing newsletters? That's where we should get creative. That's where we should use AI, et cetera. There's proven ways to do sales and marketing, right? We don't really need to like go to anything that's never been done before. If we have a great service, we simply just need to like adhere to the fundamentals, find people who need it, give them value, get them on the call, show them the problem, the opportunity cost of not working with us, give them some free value, maybe make a free sample for them, and they're going to want to work with us. It's like we don't need to reinvent the wheel for anything other than our core fulfillment process. And so that means solving every other problem in your business follows a pretty similar pattern to like how every other business has done anything. So I think when I say smart people, I'm going to rephrase that to be people who were good at school, because people who are good at school and smart people is not always the same thing. But a lot of people who are good at school tend to think they need to figure things out for themselves. They tend to devalue things that are easy. They tend to value complexity and novelty when in tons of situations, they're very unproductive beliefs. And I've maybe drafted this before. Like I'm sure I have a draft on my computer of a blog post that's like the top 5 things straight A students need to unlearn if they want to be good at business. I've like almost written that blog post before.
This is you because you're also a valedictorian and you were that student. Is that where that's coming from?
Totally. So I definitely had to learn to surrender to proven processes. Like where can I find a methodology that's already been done? Again, accounting's the easiest example because accounting's not broken. Like how are we going to keep track of our money? We're going to use damn accounting. That's how you keep track of your money, is you use accounting. How are you going to collect payments? Right? I'm not going to build a payment processor. I'm just going to use Stripe. But when it comes to project management or marketing, these things that are a bit more fuzzy, or maybe you haven't like been introduced to a proven system before, people are like, I'm going to figure out our sales and marketing from scratch. I'm going to figure out our project management from scratch. It's like, no, dude, just like start with Agile, start with EOS, start with some proven system, adopt it wholesale, right? Like go find someone who's done this before. Someone's going to have a course or a book called Project Management for Marketing Agencies, and go do that and learn it. And it's going to be better than whatever the hell you come up with. So like do that for literally everything except for your service delivery or building your product. It's like, you got to be good. If you sell something, like the thing you need to be good at is the thing you sell. Everything else, just do it the way everyone else does it until you reach a point where, again, you have to know what the rules are before you should think you're capable of breaking the rules. Like until you've gotten to the level of the person who made the system, only then should you think you're smarter than them. But a lot of people have hubris and have ego. It's like, I'm smarter than everybody. It's like, no. Why should you expect to be good at this? Why should I expect to come up with a better project management system than the guy who wrote a book after consulting with 10,000 businesses and coming up with a project management system that worked for all of them? It's like, I think because I got good grades in school, I'm going to come up with a better solution than the guy who's done this 10,000 times because, quote, I'm smart. It's like, no. So that was a big thing to get over. The desire to be original in unnecessary places.
Yeah, and the example you gave even of your YouTube channel growth of just using existing content, just turning it into like the Alex Hormozis, the people that people already listen to. I mean, that's an example of, it's a simple insight, but it requires the humility to say like, hey, I don't have to come up with the most creative thing by myself, completely by myself from my own creation. I can just use something that's existing that people already are showing demand towards. Last question for you, and this sort of how I've started ending a lot of the podcasts is to understand what is it currently that you're driven by?
I love that question. I mean, I think I'm driven by a lot of the same things. Some of it's, I don't want to say like, one is a feeling that I have a lot of potential in life, right? Like someone's like, you could almost say like driven by gratitude, a combination of gratitude and obligation. Like I feel like I'm very blessed to be in a good circumstance, like a great situation, very great circumstances. It's like I'm young. Things are going well. I'm a fool if I like squander this opportunity to like do something excellent with this. Again, some of it's just like an indebtedness to the world in the sense of like, again, I've been blessed with what feels like in the scheme of things a pretty easy life. And so I should probably do something rewarding with that. Like the world's been good to me, so I should be good back to the world. And then some of it also is like, well, I'm not just going to like, some of it's like, you could call it wisdom in air quotes. I don't want to like have the arrogance of saying it's wisdom, but the wisdom of knowing that if I get comfortable here and like coast, I'm like, all right, I'm good. Like this is good. I like this income level. Like I'll just chill here. Whatever I got to do to maintain, that's just going to bore the hell out of me. It's like, you're just going to feel purposeless. And that's going to be like a path that leads to depression. So just like the wisdom to know that young men are meant to work hard. It's like, you just are, you know what I mean? It's like, and you're supposed to have fun, but like, if you don't have a sense of building and pushing towards something, you'll be very nihilist very quickly. And then some of it's also just like, I said, hypothetically, if I was happy with this income level, then great. But like, I'm also just not like, I'm comfortable to support myself right now, but I don't make enough, like when the business isn't to a point where it's like, I could pull in a salary to retire a wife and raise a family. It's like, and so I like, that's, I at least got to get there before I'm chilling. And so like, some of it's just like, I'm not done getting to like the baseline goals of and I'm single now, but like, could I get married, have kids, and have a stay-at-home mom? It's like, not yet. So like, I got to get there before I fully call it chilling. That's like your spiritual and pragmatic answer.
That's a beautiful answer, and that's a very true answer. Like it feels like it's very true to you. Is there a number in your mind?
I mean, I think it'll depend. When I do find that person, we find a place to live. Like a lot of that will produce the information. It's like if I meet like, let's say like this is a funny word, but I'll go with crunchy. If I meet a crunchy girl who just like wants to live in a yurt in Colorado, the number probably doesn't have to be too high. Cause I'm like, I could live out of a yurt and like put a trampoline in the back and I don't know, just have some bison around. That sounds kind of nice. And like, probably could like afford that now, probably. But like if I, meet some girl in New York and she's like, we need like this whole New York penthouse situation and the kids are going to like Stuyvesant High School, and it's like, all right, it's a bigger number. I'm just like, I just don't know what that life looks like yet. I don't know like where we want to raise, if it's like, hey, like, let's just like have enough money to like buy a cow and Starlink and homeschool these kids, then it's like, all right, well, I probably have enough money for a cow and Starlink. But if it's like, we need to be in the country club and I just don't know. A lot of that kind of depends on the person and the circumstances.
Well, it seems like since you're heading probably to New York, it's an upward trajectory for now.
It's a larger
It's
number.
not the cows for now.
I'm mentally preparing myself for being a bigger number.
Final question actually on this. When you think of money, what does it mean to you?
I mean, I think it's potential is probably the best one word for what it represents. Like it's if we literally think about like kinetic energy versus potential energy, money just represents a store of potential energy. Like you could just go accomplish things. Like it's convenience to some extent. And so if it's convenience, then it's also time. Like, but money is just like the most democratized version of potential energy. Because it's like, I could just not cook for a year if I spend enough money. I just don't have to do that. Like, if I don't want to cook, I just spend money and I don't have to cook. So it's just the ultimate, again, if you're a slave to it, I think it's like a Rockefeller quote. He's like, I want to make my money a slave to me, not the other way around. But the accumulating money is accumulating options. Because then it's like, well, if I've got this much, then I could do like, here's all these hypothetical scenarios of like things I could do because I have enough money to do them. So it's just potential will be like the most basic. And so it's kind of the same thing. It's like, if I'm not super clear on what I want to do next, like accumulating money is kind of a useful thing to do as long as you're not making yourself miserable in the pursuit of it and doing it in like a, let's say, I don't want to say unbalanced because like balance is a loaded word that I think a lot of people misuse, but like, let's go with unhealthy. If like the pursuit of it is driving you to be unethical or unhappy or unhealthy, then like that sounds like an unhealthy pursuit. Versus if it's just like, yeah, like this is fun. And the more of it I have, the more stuff I can do. Fun, useful, charitable, selfish, whatever. It's worthwhile, right? And then it just so happens, and this is what you said about the working on you more than you work on it. It turns out to like make a lot of money, you have to be pretty damn capable and resourceful. Like more often than not, you don't make money unless you are really useful, unless you're really talented, or unless you're really good at something. And so by being capable of earning a lot of money, you generally improve as a person, right? So like for me, If I didn't learn anything last year, like I wouldn't have learned. So, the other thing I meant, like when I was kind of going through that whole speech about business and it's like a rite of passage and everyone goes through the same journey. The other big one, besides like the humility to just adopt systems, is the need to delegate, right? It's like number 3 on every entrepreneur is like, if I'm like going to map out a 12-step plan of like, you're going to first, this is going to be the problem. You have to learn, like, you have to realize that business is about solving problems, not just about making shit that you want to make, right? That's number 1. That's like, if you don't overpass that obstacle, good luck. You're going to be stuck at square 1 for quite some time. Then once you get to square 2, which is you solved a problem. Okay, but how do you solve more of it for more people? You have to delegate stuff. So which means you can't do everything. All right, that's like number 2. So that's the other big belief, like delegation, and then complexity and things like that. But when I say delegation, trying to remember the point I was just making about like why I bring that up in terms of money or delegation. To make a lot of money, have to be, so this is what I was getting at, like why pursuing money if you don't really know what to do is still not such a bad pursuit. Because in order to make a lot of money, it turns out, like you're saying, again, the Alex Hormozy thing, the work works on you more than you work on it. The person you become in pursuit of making a lot of money is actually a better version of you. Because to become that person, you need to be the person capable of achieving a lot of money. And like another kind of saying that I have is, in general, markets are efficient, which is like very rarely do you go find things underpriced, right? So it's like, why is it so much cheaper in Mexico City? It's like there's an arbitrage there. It's like, then you go there and it's like, okay, like there are things here that are worse. And that's a bad example because like Mexico City is great. But the point is, like, things are, for the most part, things are fairly priced. Everyone's like, why is New York so expensive? It's like, because it's better, right? Because it's like you have more opportunity to make money there. So there's just more wealthy people, which means you're like, it's not overpriced. It's like the apartments are shit there and the weather shit, but it's like, okay, but the amount of money flowing through that city is 100 or 1,000x the money flowing through other cities. So it's like, it is worth the price. Like expensive gyms, why are they more expensive? Because they're nicer. Like more often than not, things are priced correctly. Things are not priced incorrectly for that long because people find out about them and then the market corrects itself. And so all that to say,
especially if things have been existing for a while.
yes,
They are
exactly.
definitely priced. With enough time, they're definitely priced even more correctly.
Exactly. And New York's more expensive because it's better. Again, it's if you don't value, if it's not better for things that you value, then it's overpriced for you. But in general, right, like it's more like there's just, anyway, you understand the point, and the people listening to as well. So when I bring that back to income potential, people who earn more money provide more value than people who earn less money, more often than not, right? Again, some of them are Hunter Bidens of the world, and but again, he's paid that money because his dad's Joe Biden, so it's still value, right? It's like he's just a chip, he's just a puppet in the transaction, but he's still a useful puppet, right? Because it's like no one else could be that puppet because no one else is like, again, so the point is like even people who got nepotism into certain positions, well, to some extent, you're still access to this wealthy family. So just by you being a body in this situation and creating this like complex social contract of indebtedness, you are still providing that value. That's not fair, but it is true. And so anyway, when you're someone who has a high income potential, especially on your own merit, it's because like you have skills, right? Like a salesperson who can sell $1 million a year worth of stuff is going to get paid better than someone who doesn't know how to sell $1 million worth of stuff. Someone who can spell expensive things, a software engineer who writes better code. But like, I'm not going to get to that level of income without getting better at business, without getting better at hiring, without getting better at building systems, without getting better at marketing. And that's pretty much the whole point. So it's like pursuing money to the extent it's not consuming your entire life and you're not also still developing in other areas at the same time is a pretty good forcing function or good simplification function, because in pursuit of that, you're going to acquire skills and knowledge and experience. Otherwise, you're not going to succeed in the goal.
You said you didn't want to use the word balance, but the balance, I think, in this situation lies in understanding the perceived importance of money and not projecting it more than what it actually is.
Yeah,
So
right.
I think that's where the balance comes, not necessarily in the output or how much effort you're putting
like
in
the
to get it.
day-to-day way that time is spent, right?
Right, right. Dude, this is an extremely valuable, speaking of value, conversation for me. And this is a very random thing. I don't even know if it's going to be part of the podcast here, but one conversation that I had a few days ago with a friend was, how would you value a podcast as a business if you were to just put a podcast by itself? And the thing that really came up for me was, one way to do it is to just take the hourly rate of the people that are on the podcast and the cumulative sum of the entire hourly rate times the hours you've actually recorded a conversation of you and the guest is one way to value it. And sometimes there's a lot of, when you get guests earlier on, like I am now, this is the first episode. The episodes early on felt like the value is very low in terms of, just because there is no one actually looking at it as much. But there is an inherent value. And the question is, how can you convert that inherent value if you take this hourly rate concept into more extrinsic value for the right people, with the right people seeing it?
It's an interesting way to think about it. It all depends what you as the host, no one's ever going to, not no one ever, because that's not necessarily true. You're definitely going to be the top 10 people or top 0.01% of people who care the most about this podcast. That's like ultimately the person who should benefit the most. And I'm like watching my words carefully to make sure I agree with myself. But it's up to you why you're doing this, what you hope to achieve with it, and whether that is you want to have a positive impact on the people listening. That's still you wanting to have that impact as well. So, and that's not saying that's like a misguided or that waters it down or makes it less genuine, but trying to, yeah, you always want to be clear, right? Because for me, like when I said the reason I started my podcast was to like, I want to do it intrinsically, but like, why do I want to do it intrinsically? Like, why did I enjoy those conversations, right? Because it's like, I felt like I was learning things that were important, or I was, and then at a certain point, like it became, okay, well, I want to learn what I need to learn to start a business. But now that I have a business, why do I continue doing the podcast, right? So you have to constantly reevaluate if it's still serving you, if the original scorecard is the up-to-date scorecard that makes sense, if the mechanism still worthwhile.
Being honest with yourself about it.
That's right.
Man, thank you so much, Louis. This has been extremely fun, and I have learned a ton. And I know when I'm going to watch this conversation again, there's a few tactics that, like, very tactical things you said that were very interesting. And I hope that people, when they listen to that, they actually use that. Try the exercise out. You said the 4 quadrant system. I think that was very interesting.
Can
Yeah,
I drop one final nugget?
please.
Yeah. I don't even know where I heard this, but I'm not going to give myself credit for it. I just think it's very important, and I'm trying to embody it, right? We don't learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on experience. We don't learn from ideas. We learn from reflecting on ideas. So you get, I'm going to make up a number. Like I could say 10, I could say 100, I could say 1,000. You get significantly more value, like a disproportionate amount of value. Like, so let's say you invest 5 hours in reading a book. And that's all you do with that book. That's your only interaction with the material. Versus if you read a book and then spend 10 minutes recording a video of yourself explaining the main takeaways from the book, right? You've gone from 5 hours to 5 hours and 10 minutes. I think your retention of that material for the next 5 years increases by a factor of 10 by investing literally an extra 1% effort, right? So that's like that. There's like these books called like The Slight Edge and all that stuff. And so if you've invested an hour and a half listening to this podcast or 30 minutes listening to this podcast, if you invest 33 minutes or 95 minutes instead of 90, or literally 91 minutes, and you take like 30 seconds to open up the notes app on your phone or to pull out a piece of paper and to ask yourself the question, what are 3 useful ideas I got from this? Or what is one thing I want to do differently in my life? And like not think through the exercise, but like if you're on a bike or if you're washing the dishes or you're like driving a car, like not, let's drop driving a car, but you're riding a bike or you're washing the dishes. If you take the 30 seconds to stop this and before you jump into the next thing, write down on a piece of paper, what are 2 useful things here? Why did I enjoy this? What is something I want to do differently? That is more a additional 0.1% investment of time for literally 100x difference in return of actually seeing any value translate into your life from having spent the time with us.
Very powerful observation. And if you're driving a car, just stop on the side and do the same, I would say.
Yeah.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.